So there's a misconception that if you're single, you are incomplete, perhaps damaged, salvaged, and you won't be happy until you find your one. And that is not true. That is bullshit. It is a message that has been fed to us by media and advertising. The truth is, when you're single, you have the richest soil for growth. That's why I created this podcast. And unlike other podcasts, this one is host-driven, not guest-driven. That means I will be rotating health and wellness experts 3 times a week to give you the giant box of wellness crayons, not just the primary colors, so you can start building a meaningful life. It's time to give singlehood a cape. Today's guest is Megan Bruneau, and her and I go way back. We're talking Tumblr days. We both started as bloggers, and it's been a treat to watch her thrive and make a huge dent in this world. She's a therapist, executive coach, and the author of How to Be Alone and Together, 72 Lessons on Being at Peace with Yourself. She helps her clients and readers gain the awareness and psychospiritual tools necessary to do the shit that scares them and to create the life they deserve. What I love about Megan is she is transparent. She documents her story. She is honest, and I just think she's so courageous. Enjoy Megan Bruneau. Megan, first I want to say thank you for being a host and a contributor. I think you bring a lot of value, not only because you're a therapist and of course you've helped thousands in your practice. You're also, a content creator, blogger, speaker, all that stuff, but especially because you, like me, share your own story. And you've been through a lot of things, well, like everyone else, and
Yes.
you've been single, and you've been in relationships, and you've been single, and you've been in relationships.
Yes,
So, yeah.
so, such is the crazy making pattern of life, it seems. But yes, thank you for saying that, John. And I mean, I think I say this on every podcast that we're on together, but you have been such an inspiration for me in sharing my story and like such a trailblazer in kind of going against like what the traditional model was of being a therapist, which was like be the blank slate and pretend that, you have all your shit together. I feel like you and I both were like, we have all these issues we're dealing with too. Like, so
Right.
Thank you for paving that path.
Yeah, you're brutally honest, and almost to the point where we're going to start getting competitive to see who's more honest and raw. But yeah, we go way back. I feel like I went to high school with you.
I know. It does feel that way, doesn't it? I mean, I guess.
Yeah,
it's been 8 years at least. It's been 2014 was when we met, so that's significant.
Mind, body, green, revitalize.
Yeah, in the age
Back
of like very short
Yeah.
relationships and transient friendships and fears of intimacy. We've had a long relationship, John.
Do you still blog the way that you used to, or no?
No,
Meaning the amount of time. Yeah,
I don't. And I was actually thinking about this yesterday because I was like, why don't I like write as much anymore? And perhaps some of it's that I just, my energy is going other places. But I think actually it's the more I learn, the more I'm like, how naive was I to like think that I could be an authority on this thing? Like, I almost feel like the more I learn, the more I'm like, I don't actually know anything at all. And who am I to speak on this topic? So we'll see how that goes for our conversation today, because I, might be like, it could be this and it could be this, but there is no right or wrong.
That sounds like to me, you evolving, because it sounds very Buddhist to say,
yes.
I know nothing.
Totally. I know nothing.
Right.
I feel so, I almost look at I cringe a little bit, to be honest, and with compassion. Like, I like compassionately cringe at my younger self and some of the content I put out there. And I'm like, oh, sweetheart, like, I think that helped some people, which is great. And it was entertaining. And also, like, there's a completely different lens to look at this through that could be equally as valid. And so, I think we just want to be mindful in the age of so much content out there to just look at it all through like a critical lens where like it could serve some people, but if it doesn't serve you, like that doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong. It might just mean that it's not the right fit for you.
So this podcast is obviously for single people, but it's also for anyone, even if you're in a relationship, to connect to yourself first. For me, it started with a divorce. When you think about your singlehood journey, and you've been on many, What's the first one that kind of comes to mind?
I like the way you frame
that. Are you laughing or crying?
Yeah, exactly. Like, you've been, from my understanding, you've been heartbroken many times from your oversharing.
Well, no, I have as well. We all have. I mean,
totally. No.
And I think the whole point is that we talk about that instead of, pretending like that didn't happen or, filing it, in a cabinet somewhere.
Exactly. And I think like heartbreak is such a spiritual opportunity. I mean, I look back on every experience that I've had of, either heartbreak or heartache and, or becoming single against my will. And I'm so grateful for those experiences. Like not in the moment, I struggle.
Yeah, never in the moment, of course.
Recent, I went through like a pretty rough breakup this past year. And even in that moment, I could be like, look, I know I'm going to get to a point where I'm grateful for this. And it was such an incredible spiritual lesson on so many levels and really helped me like tap into my childhood trauma and like learn things about my father that I never had, realized before and stuff like that. Very cliche stuff, repetition compulsion, as we call it as therapists, where we like repeat our childhood trauma. But anyway, so in terms of like my singlehood journey that I've been on, many, as you said, what was the question you were asking? Sorry,
if I was to say to pick one, what, without thinking, what kind of comes to mind? Would it be your last one? Because I know that one was difficult.
Yeah. And I mean, look, I'd say I've had two massive heartbreaks in my life, 10 years apart. And they were both, I don't think I can say like one was more formative than the other.
Were they very different?
Yes. I mean, of course, they were very different, but there was a similarity of wanting to, again, so much childhood stuff reenacted, but like wanting to prove myself and prove my worth and be chosen and be seen and be loved in the way that I didn't believe I was, growing up. And ultimately, feeling abandoned, when that was like my biggest fear and all of that kind of stuff. But the lesson, I mean, there were multiple lessons in both of them, but, the first one really actually sent me down the path of spirituality, right? Like until that point, like I was, let's see, that was 20.
How old were you?
11. I was 24 at the time.
You said 11. I thought you meant... You said 11, and you were doing math in your head. You said 11. I was like, "You're 11 years old." That was wow. We're going way back.
My first massive heartbreak at 11 years old. That's when I discovered Buddhism.
Right. I was like, "Wow!" At 11, you went spiritual. That's amazing. 24, you said. So around, which is actually that's early 20s is when we experience. I think the first shatter. The first big heartbreak. Yeah.
It was my first experience of realizing that these like scripts we follow in life that we internalize through like Disney movies and fairy tales and stuff like that. It was my first experience of being like, oh, this actually isn't true. Like you can do all the things and you can't control whether or not someone leaves you or whether or not you're heartbroken. And until that point, like I was really struggling actually with eating disorders at the time. And that had been my journey, like eating disorders and depression and anxiety. And I'd kind of
real quick. I just want to say, I'm going to interrupt you many times because
please. I talk forever. Interrupt.
I also want to applaud you being so open with eating disorders. I don't know if you know this, but I worked at an eating disorder treatment center, running groups for many years, private, and then also some nonprofit stuff. And it's it's one of those things where it's very shame based, and not a lot of people talk about it. And so you talking about that openly. On your Instagram photos and just confessionals and stuff, I think helps so many people struggling with that.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And I think, go ahead. Yeah.
I didn't know what I was going to call this episode, but now I know it's going to be called My First Heartbreak. So 24, struggling with an eating disorder. Was it just happening or was it like full blown? Like it was difficult.
It was pretty full blown at that point. So I struggled with bulimia for many years from when I was like 15. So I'd been struggling with bulimia for like 8 years. And then in the last couple of years before this massive heartbreak, I started actually like working at a gym. It was so ironic. I was finishing my master's degree in psychology and I was like in the throes of, at that time, anorexia. I was working at a gym on the side as a personal trainer. Like I was like really deep in that. And perfectionism, which really is this kind of like house of cards strategy for managing our shame. Like if I look perfect, if I act perfect, then, I can prevent heartbreak, shame, abandonment, any of those sorts of things, rejection, failure. And so I was like doing all the things and I like graduated from my prestigious master's program and I was like, very underweight. And like, I thought I'd checked all the boxes, and my boyfriend of 3 years, who I totally thought at that time, like I was going to marry and whatever, he ended up, leaving me. And actually, my understanding is that he sort of left me for someone else. And that had been my biggest fear, because that's actually what happened with my parents. Right. So my dad left my mom a number of times, ultimately 4 times, but was having an affair with someone.
What do you mean by full? So as you were growing up, I'm assuming early on, your dad left and came back, left and came back.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
How did this affect you as a kid, seeing that, experiencing that?
So I think it was very confusing. I was 8, between 8 and, about 9 or 10 was like the kind of, over the course of a couple of years, he left and came back a number of times, and was having an affair with someone. He was a lawyer and was having an affair with somebody at his firm. And this was like very hard on my mom, obviously. Right.
Yeah.
And I think for my brother and me, like we were just sort of confused and didn't really understand what was happening. Our parents, it's not like our parents, I think, had a good marriage before that. Like we were the kids that were always at the top of the stairs, like listening to our parents scream at each other. Right. So like, it's, I think in many cases, an affair is just a symptom, right, of there being challenges already within the relationship. My parents were that classic, like anxious, avoidant, extremely anxious on my mom's end, extremely avoidant on my dad's end, a bit of that kind of like NPD, BPD stuff mixed in there. And so it was, it wasn't a healthy situation anyway, but then I think that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. And so in terms of how it affected us, or affected me, I should say, like, I think, at that time when my dad left, my mom left too, because she was like incapacitated, right? Emotionally, and really struggled, and, had a lot of her own mental health and addictions challenges as well. So I think it just caused me to grow up really young. And I remember being like 8 years old and being kind of like on the edge of her bed, like supporting her and, being her
growing
therapist.
up fast.
Totally growing up super fast and being friendified. And, that also instilled in me some codependent tendencies, which we might get into today.
Yes. Sorry, I got to interrupt again. Let me just footnote.
Yeah.
I just interviewed yesterday Melody Beattie.
Oh my God, amazing. Yeah. Look at you. I've been crushing it, John. I just love it.
She wrote Codependency No More in the 80s. And it's crazy because I think before her, no one even knew what codependent. She like actually gave it language, which was
totally. So
listening to that, and then
the woman who wrote Women Who Love Too Much. Oh, sorry, God, you'll edit that out.
I think there were 2. I would say foremothers when it comes to codependency. Yeah. But she's obviously a huge one. 7 million copies sold.
Wow.
Can you believe that?
Well, because it resonates for so many of us, right? Like, being able to have a label to understand like, I'm like abandoning myself constantly because I fear being abandoned by another, or I get my self-worth out of taking care of someone, or I only feel relevant and worthy in the world if I feel needed by someone else.
Yes. And so for me, what hit me is when you said parentified, and then she was saying that if you grow up without having a safe tree, if you grow up where, you have to grow up fast, or if you grow up where the attachment with your parents isn't healthy and safe. I grew up with my parents are always gone because they're working. Then that's kind of where the seed of codependency can start. And so as you're telling me the story, and you just have interviewed her yesterday, connecting dots, and it's making sense.
Well, and it's so interesting because it's like, we learn how to love in the context of our childhood relationships, right? Or our relationships with our parents. And so what my like love map was, or what I learned love was, with my dad, it was sort of feeling neglected, to be honest, and never really feeling important or good enough, and only kind of getting attention if I was like, getting A's or getting awards or scoring goals. And even then, like, kind of didn't really feel that important, or seen or valued. And so that kind of kicked me into a pattern with men where I was always trying to like prove myself and prove my love and care for me and pay attention to me. And that felt very familiar. And then with my mom, it was very much like taking care of her emotional needs, and like needing to be her therapist, and only feeling safe and like worthy if I was needed. Right. So that also kicked me into certain relationships, romantic and otherwise, friendships and things as well, where I felt like our conversations had to always center around someone else's like problems, or they needed to like need me in some way. And that gave me a sense of security because I wasn't going to be abandoned, or I might, get the attention that I needed or have my needs met as I did as a child when, if my mom was doing better, then we'd be more likely to, have like an actual dinner or whatever. But, it also creates this pretty unserving relationship to love, or relationships where you can't just exist together and believe that like you're worthy and enough. And there's kind of this chronic anxiety that you're going to be left unless you're serving some purpose for someone, which has kind of been my journey, honestly, up until even today.
So, I'm curious, does this ripple into friendships? So I wonder with women, I wonder if you're the one that everyone comes to for advice, you take care of them, like kind of the tracks that related with you and your mom. And then I wonder with men, especially love interests, you are seeking the validation, approval, and afraid, or the false belief that they will leave,
Totally.
Leave,
yeah.
kind of
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both those things are very accurate. My journey has been one of learning how to set boundaries, which again is not an unusual journey for many of us who perceive ourselves as codependent or parentified or whatever. So when it comes to friendships, I have been really lucky that one of my like places of resilience in a lot of sort of chaos in my childhood was my female friendships. So I had very, very good girlfriends that actually to this day at 36 years old, I still have like constant contact with.
Nice.
And so, and I'm so grateful for that, because I sometimes wonder, like, they were my safe kind of attachment figures, right? Where I did learn that I was loved unconditionally and I could get in a fight with someone and, I could be imperfect, and they really like were witnesses to my life and have seen me through the most challenging periods of my life, and even today. So I did have, I'd say, several very healthy, like examples of relating, and those existed within my friendships. However, I also have learned, and I continue to learn, that I do tend to be a bit of a like moth to a flame when it comes to people who might be more on that like personality disorder spectrum when it comes to like, borderline personality disorder or narcissism or things like that, because I am very much kind of like drawn to trauma, and I have a lot of my own. And
what about addiction, like addicts?
Addiction, totally, yeah, absolutely. Like any place where I can see myself like
taking care of,
right? Taking care of and trying to save someone. And, it took me a long time to realize that you don't have to be friends with everyone who wants to be friends with you. Especially when I moved to New York and I didn't actually have like a network of friends there. That's where I live right now. I'm in Austin at the moment. But, when I moved to New York, I remember being like, oh, okay, clean slate. I was like 28 years old or whatever. And I was like, I don't have any friends. I didn't know anybody there. And so I was like, okay, like, oh, you want to be a friend? Okay, sounds great. And then I would start hanging out with people and I'd be like, I don't know, there's something that doesn't feel right about this, or this feels kind of unhealthy or weird. And it was strange for me because I was used to really healthy friendships back home. And so it's actually been interesting, like the past 8 years, I've really been like honing in on my skills of like, okay, that person wants to be friends with me or they want to hang out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to. And I do think, not unlike relationships, when we get to a certain age, there sometimes, like when a person really wants to be your friend or really wants to date you at an age at which like we kind of should have those relationships established, unless someone has like just moved to a city, sometimes there's a reason why somebody like doesn't have stable friendships, right? Like they still have a lot of trauma they haven't worked through. And there might be a bit of, some unhelpful characteristics there that we need to protect ourselves from. And learning boundaries and learning to like say no to people who I perceive to be suffering to protect myself has been very fucking challenging, but also incredibly rewarding and empowering. And like to learn like, oh, actually I can protect myself is like the most empowering thing that we can, especially if we have relational trauma, which I do, which most of us do, right? To be able to recognize, okay, I can protect myself now. Like that is such an empowering place to come to, and something I think all of we singles or all humans out there should learn how to do.
If you don't, then there's always going to be a leak, right?
Totally.
A crack in your life container, because you're allowing people to come in who are unhealthy. So just the revelation that you can choose friends and not everyone who you are friendly with has to be your friend is huge. And this is, when you're single, this is the best time to kind of clean house.
Totally. And I think it's really hard there are a number of things that are hard in this day of, technology and social media and constant communication. Like there used to be a time where if you didn't really want to be friends with someone, unless they ran in your core group or have a relationship with someone for that matter, unless they ran in your core group, like they had to show up at your house basically to like, make you feel really uncomfortable and like set the boundary. Right. But now it's like, okay, but they're responding to my Instagram story, but they're like sending me a text, but they're asking me this thing, like text, whatever, social media, that kind of thing. So it's a lot harder to be like, no, like
they can get a hold of, they can get a hold of you in so many ways.
It's so many ways, through the side
right? Window, through the front door, right?
Exactly.
Or coming down the chimney.
Yeah. Where there was a time where it's like, okay, like you can kind of like separate. It's a lot harder.
And you won't see them. Right.
Exactly. You won't see them.
True.
So it takes like a fucking warrior to be able to really set boundaries with people that we need to set boundaries with, both physically and emotionally.
If you unfollow or block and they know, people take that very personally.
Totally. So, and again, when we're talking about trauma, I mean, so much of like, I think both of us look at things oftentimes through an attachment lens. And if we have some more of that like insecure attachment where we struggle to set boundaries or, we don't necessarily know how to communicate, or we tend to go more into that fight or flight mode in the face of conflict versus being able to navigate it in a healthy way. Something like setting a boundary with somebody who could lash out at us. Like if we learn that setting a boundary growing up meant we're going to be attacked, like physically or verbally, or maybe neglected, given the silent treatment by a parent, or like, manipulated in some way, then the thought of setting a boundary is really scary. So it's not so simple as just being like, oh, just set the boundary. It's like, okay, we have to work through our nervous system's response to even anticipating setting that boundary, which is like, holy shit, if I do this, then I'm going to be attacked. And like, we have to remind ourselves, like, we're safe and it's okay, and do what we need to protect ourselves from any repercussions of saying no, essentially.
You're 24. This is the big one. The first time your heart has been shattered. You're struggling with eating disorder, working at the gym, studying psychology. What do? How did you start rebuilding yourself? How did you get over? I don't know if the word is getting over a breakup, but how did you start healing?
Yeah. Well, I think so. The first thing that was really impactful for me was I had, at the time, because of all of my, eating disordered behavior, I had been over exercising so much that I had a bunch of injuries. And my physical therapist was like, you can't keep working out in this way. You're going to be a cripple, basically. And so the only thing you can do is yoga. And
wait, what were you? Tell me what you were doing. Give me an example of what over-exercising was.
Just like running for, I was in kilometers at the time, but I was running like a half marathon a day. Like I was just so much running and like a lot of, and just like weightlifting and stuff, circuit training, like at the gym and stuff, just like, and not a lot of stretching, just constant, just like, and I do believe now when I look back, I was just trying to regulate my nervous system. I was just trying to navigate my anxiety. And that was the only way that I knew to kind of like move stuff through my body. I've obviously since learned much healthier ways to get into my body.
It was a way of numbing. Exercising was almost a way. Yeah,
it was a way of numbing, and like I think sometimes it helped me process things and move things through in terms of trauma, but much of the time it was just a disconnection from my body versus a connection to it. And so I started doing yoga begrudgingly because my physical therapist was like, this is the only thing you can do. And I noticed that like it was helping me physically in terms of my injuries, but I also like started sleeping a bit better. And, I started crying a lot more like in the yoga room and whatnot. I was like, oh, this is interesting. And so that was actually, I think that was before the actual breakup had happened, that I had just gotten into yoga. And then when it happened, I continued with that. And that really helped me start to process. And in addition to that, I started kind of adopting more yogic principles. Not that yoga is rooted in Buddhism, but kind of like spirituality in general. I started reading a lot of like spiritual texts. Someone gave me the book When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron, which like changed my life because it helped me change my relationship to sadness. Until that point, I had just, I just numbed any uncomfortable emotion that I experienced through, again, my eating disordered behavior. Oh my gosh, love that. Living Beautifully. Yes, such a good one. She is everything.
She's
but
great.
So I kind of like, I actually very viscerally remember this moment where, for the first couple of weeks, or maybe it was the first few days, I like woke up in my apartment in Vancouver, British Columbia is where I was living. And it's like, you wake up from the breakup, and I'm not sure if you remember this from your divorce or if this resonates, but like, I've been going through a breakup this past year as well. So I've been experiencing this again, but you have dreams that you're back together, right? Like the person is just infiltrates your dreams.
Sure,
and they're there and you're back together, and, or they're coming back and they want to make things work. And you experience this relief in your dream. And then you wake up, and for like a split second, you're like, oh, everything's okay. And then like reality sets in, and it's just this.
Oh, so you're almost like re-traumatizing yourself.
Every morning. It's just like, oh, fuck, like this is the reality I'm dealing with. And for so long, not for so long, but for at least a few days or weeks, I can't quite remember because it was more than a decade ago at this point. I remember being like, oh, like you're too good for him. And like, don't feel that man. I was trying to sit in anger because anger, as we know as therapists, much of the time, anger is just a secondary emotion. It's a response to something more vulnerable. It's a way of protecting ourselves from the shame, from the rejection, from the hurt, whatever. So I was trying to sit in anger. And then finally, and that was hard. Like that's like that, like, you know, one of my favorite spiritual sayings is pain times struggle equals suffering. And so like I was in pain and I was struggling against it, being like, no, like you can't feel this. But I was creating more suffering as a result of that. Like I was white knuckling it through.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I finally was like, after reading When Things Fall Apart, I was like, let me try this thing that she suggests. And I was like, hey, sadness, like, what's up? Like, you can be here. Hey. And there was this relief and kind of this, like, I mean, it was very vulnerable to actually let myself feel the sadness, but there was this relief in being like, I can live alongside this. Like, I can keep living my life sad. You know, it's not going to last forever. And that's a huge component to spirituality, is this idea of impermanence, right? So reminding myself, okay, I can actually learn how to be with my uncomfortable emotions. As a child, I couldn't, right? Because I didn't have the support there. So I had to learn how to manage them by like numbing or suppressing or, you know, being in that sort of codependent position. But as an adult, like I can learn how to support myself through pain. So that was like a really monumental shift, along with this idea that like, hey, it doesn't matter how thin you are. It doesn't matter how successful or what, you know, accolade or degree you get. Like everybody gets hurt and everybody's going to suffer through pain in their lifetime. And so accepting that, I mean, that's sort of the foundational principle again to spirituality or to Buddhism, is like the first noble truth is like life is painful, right? Yeah. And so really understanding that, like it was super painful, but it was liberating because it's like, oh, I've not been dealt a bad hand. It's not like I'm like unique or anomalous. Like this is just life. Like heartbreak is I mean, I think we're lucky. Those of us who get to experience heartbreak in life are lucky because it is such an opportunity for healing our relationships to ourselves and our trauma and learning how to cope with discomfort and like, you know, being able to have perspective and become that much more resilient, all these sorts of things. So those were a couple of the things. And then, you know, honestly, I started dancing in my room, which is, I know sounds so wild, but I remember the only thing that actually like helped me maybe distract myself or maybe like release some of the trauma was like just listening to like music. I remember listening to like Beyonce and stuff. Like it was like really like top 40 music. And I just like would dance and I would just try to like dance my way through it. And
how long? Every night, a song a night? Like, what was it like?
It was just like whenever I was really struggling, like I would just like put on like, I mean, and what was interesting too is I was unemployed at this time as well. I started working at the yoga studio because I couldn't get a job as a therapist, but it was like a really challenging time. Like I was like, okay, I've just finished 7 years of school. I've never not been in school. I can't get a job. I'm heartbroken. I'm like struggling with recovery from an eating disorder, which means weight gain, or what meant weight gain in my case. It was like, I had like no ego left. Like I was just like, who am I? I am nothing. I've lost everything. Right. And so, you know, I started like dancing in my room and I got back playing soccer, which like, you know, got back like on a sports team, which felt like, you know, community. And I started reconnecting to people because I'd really isolated myself, both in my relationship and in my eating disorder. And, you know, I think because I'd grown up so young, I kind of had this idea that at like 24, or however old I was like too old for partying and, you know, going out and like having fun. Like I should just be like working. And I kind of just like abandoned all that. And I just like found my inner child again and just started like playing. And like, I just remember honestly, like, it's not that I necessarily suggest this as a recovery strategy, but I started partying a lot. Like I'd like, you know, whatever, like it's not even that I was like drinking that much or anything. I wasn't doing any illicit drugs or anything, but I just started like going out and connect. Cause I know that what I needed was like love and connection and to be reminded that like I can exist within community. I don't necessarily need to be in a relationship, but I do need relationships and connection and love around me of people who, you know, love and accept me.
I want to highlight something.
Yeah.
Yoga, you dropping into your body, crying, and the dancing in your apartment reminds me of how trauma is stored in our body. Reminds me of I haven't read it yet, but the body keeps the score. We're saying a lot. We're promoting a lot of books in this podcast. But classics, right? And that book, I think the reason why it got so popular was because there's stuff stored in our bodies, and you know we try to outthink things. But what you were doing is through yoga, you were releasing, and then through Dancing in the Dark. You were releasing.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I've been like deep down like this psychedelic hole recently, which I like, I'm super into. And with this, especially with this. Done? Oh my gosh. I mean, I've done ayahuasca.
So, I mean, in a therapeutic
MDMA,
way, like
Bufo. Yeah.
Have you done it in therapy?
Bufo. Yeah. Wow. I mean, in like a ceremonial therapeutic setting. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and most recently, like, I did a Bufo ceremony, which is, the 5-MeO DMT.
And how
it was incredible. Like it was, and look, I mean, I want to, give all the caveats and everything. Like this is something that should really only be explored if you have like a foundation, I would say, of knowing how to be with discomfort, and a very skilled, practitioner who's going to facilitate the ceremony for you. And it is something you feel called to, and, you don't have any sort of contraindications and whatnot in terms of what medications you're taking or any kind of like vulnerabilities to psychosis. Like we can go on about all those things. But I would say for me, especially with this most recent breakup, which really kicked up a lot of my childhood stuff because it was, I think, the whole purpose of that last relationship was to understand my father and like, what he was dealing with and have more compassion for him, and also realize that it was never about me, in terms of his inability to really like show up and love me as a child or today. So, but there was a lot that got kicked up in that. And so on my journey, I found myself, exploring more psychedelic practices. And, this most recent one, especially, I was like, holy shit, trauma is 100% stored in our bodies. Any question I had about that before was removed. Like I scream cried without like, I watched myself scream cry, like through this process, sort of in a like semi dreamlike state type thing. And I really believe it was just releasing. It was like I was a little child kicking and screaming. And it's like I felt like I was having the temper tantrum I had when I was, or needed to have for all those years, when I was like this scared child that couldn't express my emotions because no one was there to take care of me.
That's so important. I'm glad you're saying this. And I think many who are listening, they may start by taking you up on just something simple as just dancing in your room.
Totally.
And how it feels. And it does, it sounds silly on the surface, but it's not, because what you're really doing is you're releasing.
Yes. Yes. And grief and trauma are stored in our bodies, right? All of our emotions are stored in our bodies. And what we experience is like a story that we attach to them, but really it just comes back to our sensations in our body. And that's what emotions are, and really even like the emotions themselves, like, I read a great book recently on the topic of books. What's it called? How Emotions Are Made or something like that. And it kind of, challenges some of these other theories that we have around like, okay, well, there's an evolutionary purpose to emotions like that, we know, but they're not necessarily uniform across cultures. Like certain ones might be in some ways, but really like, we could experience, sort of like fluttering in our stomach and our chest or whatever. And it could be that we're nauseous and, we have a flu coming on, but we interpret that as anxiety. And then we're like, oh, I'm anxious. And we create a story to make it about us feeling anxiety when actually it's like a physical sensation, because that's what emotions are. So, so much of our work in healing and processing emotions is trying to not to get too caught up in the story. Like, yes, the story can be important, but it's oftentimes like just a theory or a lie for that matter. A story, exactly as I just said. And so really what we want to do is we want to just like move that through our body because it's supposed to, rather than repressing it and like pushing it down further. And so much research suggests that like at the root of much, malady, is that the right word? Malady, like sickness, illness, whether it's psychospiritual or physical, is because of repressed emotions and that we haven't expressed them. We haven't processed them. So yeah, dancing, acupuncture, massage, even just like going for a walk and being in your body, what we call embodiment, just like being and experiencing that. The thing is, the really important thing, John, is that like for many of us, we learn it's not safe to be in our bodies. And that's what trauma recovery work is all about. It's creating a safe space within ourselves to be able to experience pain, because trauma cuts us off from it, because we learned at one point, it's not safe to be in your body. You have to cut yourself off from your experience, whether we experienced, bullying or abuse or neglect or whatever. We learned at a young age that it's not safe to be in our body. And so what we do through recovery is learn how to actually reconnect to our body and remind ourselves we are safe now. We can be in what we call the window of tolerance. If you're familiar with like polyvagal theory, and I don't want to be too jargony here, but like if you're familiar with this idea of, okay, we go into a state of like hyperarousal or hypoarousal, and that's oftentimes what's at the root of like mental illness. It's that we have a dysregulated nervous system. So our nervous system is supposed to be in this place called the window of tolerance, and that's where we feel like focused and calm and like we're able to connect to others and whatnot. It's that like tend and befriend parasympathetic nervous system response. Whereas, when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, which is fight or flight or freeze in some cases, then we do tend to find ourselves in that state of like hyperarousal, which is like anxiety or rage or, anger or whatever. Or hypoarousal is, depression or feeling like paralyzed or dissociated. So, yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that, after my divorce, and that was the big one for me, I gravitated toward CrossFit, and I wondered if that was my way of releasing, my emotions. I also, got obsessed with motorcycles and hugging canyons here in Malibu and in LA, spending a lot of time riding. And the riding motorcycles is like dancing in that you kind of dance with your motorcycle, you kind of become one, you hit flow states, and I wonder if that also was a release for me.
Absolutely. I would imagine so. Yeah, totally. And I think for me, like I haven't run since that time. Like I'm like, if I go for a run, I'm like, I don't know. It's like, there's just really no other way I can get my heart rate up or something, but I don't run anymore at all. I dance and I play tennis and soccer and stuff like that. But yes, I think that we're naturally gravitating towards movement. Like our body, we want to move as humans, and that's why I think it's so sad that like, we have put movement into this box of like exercise that's all about like weight loss and whatnot. Because sure, like there are obviously health benefits that are physiological when it comes to exercise, and it helps with obviously longevity and, mood and sleep and all these sorts of things. But really, like, we're meant to move. Like, we're meant to dance. We're meant to like, sort of like run and jump and like be agile and whatnot. And so I feel sad that so many people, and I had to negotiate this in my own recovery journey with eating disorders, they have a very unhealthy relationship to exercise where it's punitive and it's all about like compensatory, like, oh, I ate too much and therefore I need to exercise, as opposed to like, let me like move the emotions through my body and like reconnect to myself and come home and help regulate my nervous system so that I can like be in a calm, connected state. I wish that was kind of more the culture around exercise or movement than what it is today.
Do you think that this explosion of ice bath is also a way to calm your nervous system, or no?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually, I'm not an expert on any of that, like sort of Wim Hof type stuff, but I know that it very much is in that realm of like stimulating the vagus nerve, which is the nerve that actually helps regulate our nervous system, right? So all of those practices I mentioned stimulate our vagus nerve, and that's the nerve that runs basically from like our brain down through our stomach and down our spine and whatnot. And so it kind of like is that like connects mind and body. And so, there is a theory that like if we stimulate the vagus nerve, then we're able to switch more into that like regulated nervous system state where we're not hyper or hyperarousal. Exactly. Better sleep, able to be calm, and like we feel mentally well. We don't need to rely on addictive substances or any substance for that matter to numb, because we can be with our experience. So really, like, so much of mental health and healing from, heartbreak comes down to learning how to be with discomfort, right? And having the tools to regulate that discomfort and be with ourselves and support ourselves through that. And that's the journey, I think, for so many of us.
Hey, I want to do something. This would be if this podcast episode was a book. This is the part where it says, here are some questions to ask yourself. Not to be cheesy, but with this topic, what are some things that, just to bring it to street level, what are some things that the listener can do to regulate, and we talked about yoga, we talked about, exercise, possibly ice baths. What are some other things they can do to start regulating and focusing on their nervous system instead of just all the distorted thinking that we live in?
Yeah. So I think reconnecting to one's body is a journey, right? And it's interesting because many of us who are quite perfectionistic and have like high expectations for ourselves and are used to like not failing at things because we avoid anything that we might fail at, we have high expectations in this area as well. And we think, okay, well, I need to know, I need to be able to be like super aware of like what's happening in my body right away. And I need to know the perfect thing. And the reality is it takes a long time to reconnect to our body when we've been shut off from it. So for example, I remember, again, this was about a decade ago, I did a Vipassana retreat, which is like a 10-day silent retreat. Yeah, where you're like,
meditating for like 11 hours at a time or something, something crazy.
It's really intense. Like you're up at 4 a.m., like you're meditating 10 hours a day. You're not moving. You can't look anyone in the eye. You can't speak. You can't read. You can't write. You can't listen to music. You can't exercise. Like it is like, be with yourself. But the meditative technique is all about reconnecting to your body. And it was so fascinating because on day one, it was like, okay, be aware of the space underneath your nose and pay attention to that. And I was like, I can't feel this. What do you mean? Like notice the space under my nose. Mm-hmm. And as days went on, suddenly I could feel the space under my nose. And not only that, but through the technique, you start to become very aware of like, okay, eventually your body scanning. And it feels at a certain point, like a pail of water is being poured over your head and you can feel it scanning up and down. And that was such an interesting experience for me in connecting to my body. And at the end of that retreat, quote unquote, it's so not a relaxing thing, but
it's called Chinese water torture.
yeah, exactly. At the end of that course, I remember like I had always been able to like spread my toes on my right foot, but I couldn't spread them on my left. And at the end, I could suddenly spread the toes on my left foot. And it was really interesting. So I was like, wow, I actually over these 10 days really did connect to my body. And, yoga obviously helps with that. Acupuncture helps with that. All of these bodily practices help us start to connect to our body. And so what I would say for people is start with a meditative practice that is maybe a body scan. Like it's not just about focusing on a mantra. A lot of us, when we do meditation, we're like, we say a mantra if it's PM or, we like focus on a thought, but really try to focus more actually on like becoming aware in your body and trust that like this is a process. This takes a long time before we finally reconnect because for good reason, we've shut ourselves off from our bodies and we are completely disconnected. And so now where I am, like I'm at the point now when I go into acupuncture, to my acupuncturist, I'm like, ooh, I actually know, go a little bit up and to the right and like down there. And then, that's the spot. And then she can like, hit it. And then like she hits the trigger point and she's like, can you tell exactly? Like, I know my body now. Right. But so that's the same thing with like becoming aware of our emotions and becoming aware of, again, when our nervous system needs to be regulated. That's what this comes down to. So many of us don't realize when we're in a dysregulated state. And so we might not realize it until we've already reacted. We've already had the freak out at our partner, or we've already like found ourselves like deep in the pail of ice cream or, the bottle of wine or whatever it is. And so I would say, I would encourage people to, first of all, reflect on maybe what some of those more like objective measures are of when they find themselves in that state where it's like too late, like, okay, well, that probably means my nervous system was dysregulated because I engaged in some sort of like unserving coping mechanism, or there's actually some great lists out there in terms of, okay, when you're feeling really agitated, when you're, find yourself like speaking too quickly. Like I'm a fast talker as it is, but I do notice like there are times where I'm speaking more quickly and I'm maybe like feeling more anxious, or on the other side of that spectrum, the hypoarousal state, maybe you just feel like you can't get out of bed or you're super sluggish or you can't focus. So I would actually just say like, go to the internet for those questions because it's going to be much more informative than what I'm offering right now is like, how do I know my nervous system is dysregulated? It would be the question I would ask people to put into Google instead of asking themselves. And then also I would encourage them to adopt some kind of regular practice where they're trying to like become aware of their body, because what happens there is once we become more aware of our body, then we notice more in real time when we're dysregulated versus when it's too late basically. And we've already
you could catch it.
Dysregulation. You can catch it. You're like, oh, interesting. Like I'm noticing my nervous system's really dysregulated right now. What do I need? And in my case, it's like, I need to dance, or I need to call a friend. Like oftentimes we self-regulate and we co-regulate our nervous system. So self-regulation, it's just what it sounds like. Self-regulation is, when we do something on our own. Co-regulation is when we regulate in the presence of others. Usually when we're like anxiously attached, we tend to prefer co-regulation and we need to learn how to self-regulate. When we're avoidantly attached, we prefer self-regulation and we need to learn how to co-regulate. Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, we need to become more comfortable with each one of those and still use all of those techniques. But yeah, then
are you anxious or avoidant?
Anxious. I mean, come on, John. What do you think? I
assumed you were anxious. Well, I'm also anxiously attached as well.
Totally. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. That sounded actually like quite mean the way that I responded to that. I was just joking because I feel like I'm like seem so anxious.
No.
But,
But wait,
I'd
so
say
then are you attracted to avoidance, or have you dated
very much so. Very much so. Like, yes,
right.
I'm like a fucking, again, I mean, I can smell an avoidant. It's amazing. It's like you put me in a party and I will find the most avoidant man in the room. It's almost incredible. Like, it's like I think it's like a sensory thing. Like, you don't even have to open the mouths and I can just tell.
Right.
So, that's where I think there is just so much to what we're attracted to. That's like that familiarity of childhood. And like, we sense, the pheromonal piece and like how somebody stands and like their voice and whatever else. So, my work around all of that has been learning to identify my own needs and express those and, walk away when things aren't serving me, even though it's terrifying because it triggers my abandonment wound, right? But like if there isn't that reciprocity or that mutual buy-in or whatever, like after a certain point, those of us who are anxious have to stop abandoning ourselves and have to choose us, even though that's scary because we think we won't survive on our own, but we will, which I've proven to myself again and again with every heartbreak or heartache.
I hope if you're listening to this, and by the way, Megan and I, if you put us in a room, we could talk for hours.
I know.
And,
oh my gosh.
There's going to be, and there's going to be many, many episodes, whether Megan is talking to you by herself or with guests or whatever. But I want to I want to end here because I don't want to give you too much where you end up doing nothing. And so I think the takeaway with here is under the umbrella of connecting to yourself, going in through the door of dropping into your body, being aware of your nervous system, getting out of panic, fight or flight.
Yeah.
And then, whatever that looks like for you, it could be yoga, it could be CrossFit, it could be motorcycles, it could be dancing. It doesn't matter. It's different. But whatever that is, make that your daily routine. You don't have to go and meditate for 11 hours a day. That's not. And by the way, when you were saying stuff like that, I felt like such a poser because I have not done that. I've not done the psychedelics that I'm very curious about. I have not done all the things that you have done. So it makes me feel like do as I say, not as I do.
You just have, you know what it is?
I've just been lifting weights.
I was just going to say, you haven't been in enough pain recently, right? Like, it's like we do this stuff in a state of desperation.
Sure.
Like, that's why many of us explore these things is because we're like, I am so uncomfortable with my current reality that I will try this scary, uncomfortable thing in pursuit of some sort of trade-off. So I would say that's probably just a testament to the work you've already done and the life you've created for yourself, which doesn't really like push you into that place of needing to like
or maybe
some kind of healing.
Maybe it's time I need my heart broken.
Totally. I mean, it is. I will say it's funny. Journey. Like at this place I'm in right now, where it's been about 10 months since my last like massive fucking heartbreak, and I'm finally in a place where I'm like, oof, like I feel really strong as a result of that. Like that was like, it was worth it, but in those moments you're like, oh, this is so hard. But let me just say one thing in response to what you said about getting into your body. Totally. I think that's a great takeaway for everybody. The one thing I will say too is don't expect to enjoy the process. Like think of it like going to the gym, right? Like you go to the gym and you are putting yourself into a place of discomfort to build your muscles and build your strength, right? And we're helping you build your emotional strength through turning inward to your body and sometimes being in a state of pain. But the one thing you can do to really make it easier is practice self-compassion. So give yourself permission to feel sad and feel uncomfortable and feel anxious. All of that is okay. You're not failing if you feel those things. You're just human. You're having a very normal human response, likely to whatever the circumstances are that you're in. And even if it's not the normal response to the circumstances you're in, it's a normal response because based on your lifetime and your trauma and whatever you've been through, your wiring, it's the response based on like, it makes sense based on what you've been through. So really validate your experience and remind yourself, like, you're not going to die from feeling this pain. As a child, that's what you thought. And so you had to shut it off. But as an adult, you're not going to. Like, we're meant to feel our feelings. Like, it's some days it's fucking great. And other days it's like, it's like surfing, right? Sometimes you catch it. It's very cliche, but sometimes you catch the wave and other times you get like fucking smoked with the board in your head and like, like you're split under and it's just awful. And you get up and you're spitting out water and you're like, oh God, like I swallowed a bunch of salt water. Like, am I going to die? Like, that's how this feels, And so it doesn't, you're going to move through that. And with it, and you get to, the beautiful thing is you prove to yourself how resilient you are once you come to the other side of that wave, right? You're like, okay, I can do this. I can go back into the water again. And really perfectionism is what holds us back from taking risks in life and from living, life to the fullest and whatnot. And so once we prove to ourselves that we can handle the getting smoked in the waves, then we're way more able to take these risks and love again, and like take it because it's like, okay, like I might get hurt, but also I can get through it because I have the tools to be able to navigate that. So learning how to regulate your nervous system, practicing self-compassion, knowing like the resources within you and outside of you to be able to navigate heartbreak are so important to be able to like date in fucking 2022 where it's a shit show out there. That'll be another episode for us, like the stuff that we're dealing with. And I'm in it right now. So I'd say just alongside that somatic or like bodily practice, just like remind yourself it's okay to feel uncomfortable. You're training your muscles. It's just like going to the gym, but for your heart.
I love it. Megan, thank you so much for being here today. Megan is very busy. And so when she has time to jump on our little rotating carousel of wellness, known as a Single on Purpose podcast, what are some ideas for people listening that you're thinking about doing on the show?
Well, it's funny. I was actually, my good girlfriend, in Nashville, who I lived with, during this last heartbreak, who you'd reached out to me about, but, she's a chef, but she actually has a course for combining like the grief when you're going through heartbreak and like what to eat and how to navigate it, and like kind of like a really unique tailored program. So I was thinking like she and I might also talk about our heartbreaks and like riff on that and like how to navigate that. I mean, I'm like kind of
reached out to you about her because I thought cooking, nutrition, I don't have anyone in that category. Yeah. So if there's a fun way we can do that, because I know when I was single, I mean, shit, I don't know how to cook. I don't know, and so the kitchen can be a therapeutic space. So that's something. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, she is great. I find, I know I use terms like NPD and BPD, which stands for narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. But, more recently, we're kind of looking at all of these like quote unquote personality disorders, under this lens of what we call CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is really just like a response to relational trauma or attachment trauma. So I kind of want to, I haven't figured out like what I want this one to look like, but I do think it could be valuable for people to, especially in this day and age, understand if they are dating somebody who's more on that spectrum and like how to identify it and how to perhaps either extricate themselves from the relationship, because it can be very difficult when you're trauma bonded in those things. Or if not, to sort of know what to look for when dating, and how to kind of show up for ourselves versus get into those codependent dynamics, which is what I find myself in.
I love it.
And I also think that if you haven't done this already, like it's so interesting. So many of my clients who are single, like, we talk about like their attachment trauma and this and that and like what they can do, but I don't think we're recognizing enough that like dating in this day and age, this is unprecedented times, but like it really is like we're making history right now. So therapists will be like, oh, I'm 60 years old and I've been married for 40 years. I'm like, these are the things you should do. And it's like, no, we're dealing with social media, which creates completely unrealistic expectations for everyone in terms of like what they should look like physically, what a relationship should look like, porn, which does the same thing for sex, and dating apps, which is like, paradox of choice. You can just easily swipe to the next person the moment things get hard. We've got constant technology to be able to keep us in contact or feeling connected. So we're not looking as much to relationships for that. We've got all sorts of other things that are getting in the way of us being able to develop healthy relationships as singles. And especially, at this age, there are really, most of the people left in the dating pool do have some kind of attachment insecurity, because the people who are secure and healthier have kind of self-selected out and gotten married. So I think it's really important for us to acknowledge just what we're actually working with, like at this time as singles, and learn how to not personalize it all so much and see like, okay, let's work with the reality that like, actually, I think it's 31% of Americans will be lifelong singles. And that's not to be fatalistic about it and like, okay, you're never going to find that person, but how can we actually like accept the reality of what we're dealing with and adjust to a new paradigm versus trying to like, act like we're still in the 70s and, you're just going to get married to the person who like lives down the street or is like the daughter of your mom's friend or whatever. So I think that's what, and then, the last one too, is that I do think it's really important for us to talk about, how so often we have this like vision of relationships as like being the fantasy that solves all of our problems and makes us happy. And that's actually just, it's really sad to have to admit this reality. but that's actually just a coping mechanism and a way of like avoiding doing the work. And what we have to acknowledge as, singles or people in relationships is that, I think you said this, like nobody is coming to save you, right? Like there is not somebody out there that's going to like, make you happy, maybe for a couple of years, because that honeymoon stage, there's all the dopamine and oxytocin and norepinephrine and serotonin and all those things. So there is a bit of an addictive component to love and dating that kind of, distracts us from like our inner world and our challenges. But after a while, like you still have to come home to yourself. So I think it's really important to talk about kind of the fantasy that, we attach to as singles and thinking when we meet that person, everything is going to be better. And instead, like have to have a word with ourselves and be like, yo, like this sucks to admit that that's a fairy tale, that that's the Santa Claus basically of adulthood, is this idea that relationships are going to like make us happy forever. And then also be like, okay, so I actually then have to turn inward and do the work to heal my trauma and love myself and learn how to be with discomfort and find meaning and purpose and all those sorts of things. So those are just a few ideas off my head, but I'll come up with more.
I love it. More of Megan coming soon. And also, it was Vanessa who says, no one's coming to save you. And I think she said that to me when I asked her if she was coming to save me. And she said, no one's coming to save you. Anyway,
I love that. That's great.
More of Megan. Where can we find you? And, give us one thing that you want to plug or promote. You're building a lot of things. You're doing a lot of things. So
sure.
where can we find you?
You can find me. Instagram is probably my most active platform, although honestly, I'm like not the best with social media, but it's just my name, Megan J. Bruneau, MEGAN JBRUNEAU. You can also find me on my website, meganbruneau.com. I would say in terms of like what to plug, if you want to work with me or a therapist on my team or a coach on my team, like reach out. Nice. And, I've got someone to set you up with. I do have an Amazon book that's called How to Be Alone Together, 72 lessons on being at peace with yourself. So that's some just kind of like little nuggets of wisdom to help, you heal your relationship to yourself. But honestly, like what I'm working on mostly these days is like myself so that I can like really put the information out there with like that authority that I question whether or not I have in this moment. As I was talking about in the beginning of our session, like this past year, these past few years, honestly, have been so profound for me in like deconstructing everything I believed previously and now being like, oh, this is how it is. And I've been so humbled. And I feel like I'm now on the cusp of like, I'm almost ready to like talk about it with authority. So I'm doing the research right now, the me search. And I'll hopefully have more wisdom to spout for y'all soon.
Yeah, follow her, get her book. It's on Amazon, and more from Megan coming soon. Thank you for listening. Be well.
Thank you, John.
I hope that episode was helpful. Hey, listen, if you want to share your singlehood journey, if you've gone somewhere and come back, if you have revelations and wisdom, please share your story. It's going to help other people. Nothing makes us feel more connected than hearing other people's stories. So just send me the audio of your story, and you could just record it directly from your phone and email it to theangrytherapist@gmail.com. Also, if you want our Single on Purpose newsletter, go to singleonpurpose.life. That's singleonpurpose.life. You will get tools and articles and other people's stories, and also Zoom links to private gathers. So if you want to join our community, go to singleonpurpose.life. Thank you for listening. Be well. We hope you tell a friend.
So I was divorced in March of 2018, and it was a whirlwind. I used to see marriage as a self-sacrificing contract, and that's kind of what I did. I married into multiple things that really kind of made me lose sight of myself. And in 2018, I found myself alone, financially devastated, and kind of at a loss of community. And so I decided to move back to Kansas. I am not from Kansas at all. I grew up overseas. I've lived in many different states, but Kansas was the place that I went to college. And out of all the places I had lived before, it was one of the few places that I had felt free and believed that I had expressed myself. So, being here in Kansas for the last 4 years, I made some really major decisions, like deciding to buy a house when I myself have been transient in my marriage and in my childhood, but choosing to be grounded, I actually think is true to my nature. In the marriage, I was shy and kind of introverted, and I think me and you come from an immigrant household, so in school I was also deemed as introverted, when in reality, now as a career, I do stand-up comedy, and kind of eccentric stand-up comedy for different venues, and it's still something that I'm moving towards, but it's also, I'm just giving myself kind of baby steps, allowing to see how that will progress with time. I didn't realize that my marriage, like the end of my marriage, was really a death of who I had been. And about 2 years ago, I decided to become a certified end-of-life doula. And that, with the comedy as, as like kind of polar that is, really helped me grieve through what I believe was one of the biggest deaths of my life. And I've been able to thrive in singlehood, is what I would call it. I listened to you and your wife's podcast. I recently bought one of your books. I can relate so much on, learning how to choose me and being patient in that journey, because I am still learning how to choose myself. And choose myself in the way that best suits me, instead of what everyone else is, maybe projecting, or, no, I don't want to say that. Choosing myself in the way that I feel like was stifled for years, mostly, my responsibility. So I thought I'd send this recording. It's only almost 5 minutes long, but good luck. I'm excited to hear the stories you do choose, and you're doing great work. So it's an honor for you to listen to my voice.